The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Windsor Castle as Sergeant James Mitchell adjusted his red ceremonial uniform for what would become the most emotionally challenging day of his military career. 23 years he had served the crown, but nothing could have prepared him for this moment. James had been assigned to the Royal Household Guard when he was just 19 years old, fresh out of military training with dreams of serving his country. Over the decades, he had stood watch during state ceremonies, protected visiting dignitaries, and maintained the ancient traditions that defined the British monarchy. But his most treasured duty had always been the quiet moments when he interacted with the late Queen Elizabeth II. The Queen had a remarkable ability to remember the names and personal details of even the junior staff members. James recalled countless mornings when she would pause during her walks through the castle grounds, asking about his family back in Yorkshire or commenting on his garden that she had somehow learned he tended in his spare time. These weren't formal exchanges between sovereign and subject, but genuine conversations that revealed the Queen's extraordinary humanity. What made their connection even more special was their shared love for the royal corgis. The Queen's devotion to her beloved dogs was legendary, and James had often been tasked with walking them when the Queen was occupied with state business. He learned each dog's personality, their favorite treats, and their individual quirks. Muick, in particular, had become attached to James, often seeking him out during his rounds. Muick was one of the Queen's final two corgis, a dorgi actually, with the distinctive short legs and alert ears that had characterized the royal pack for generations. The Queen had received Muick as a gift during the pandemic, and the dog had provided comfort during some of her most isolated months. James had witnessed their bond firsthand, watching as the Queen would light up whenever Muick entered the room, her formal composure softening into genuine affection. The events leading to this day had unfolded rapidly after the Queen's peaceful passing at Balmoral Castle. The nation mourned, protocols were activated, and the machinery of royal transition began its ancient rhythm. King Charles III had ascended to the throne, and Queen Consort Camilla had assumed her new role with grace and determination. However, one question remained delicate and unresolved. What would become of the Queen's beloved corgis? Palace insiders whispered about the discussions taking place behind closed doors. The Queen had always been clear that her dogs were not just pets, but family members deserving of love and proper care. In her final years, she had expressed concern about their future, understanding that her advanced age meant difficult decisions would eventually need to be made. James had overheard conversations between senior staff members about the various options being considered. Some suggested the dogs should remain at the palace as part of the royal legacy. Others felt they would be happier in a more private setting where they could receive individual attention. The king, dealing with the enormous responsibilities of his new role, had reportedly asked Queen Camilla to handle the matter as she saw fit. Queen Camilla, despite her genuine efforts to honor the late Queen's memory, had never shared the same deep connection with the corgis. Her own love for animals was undeniable, but it manifested differently. She preferred rescue dogs and had always been more comfortable with larger breeds. The corgis, with their specific needs and strong personalities, represented a challenge she felt ill-equipped to handle. As James stood in the castle courtyard that morning, he reflected on the conversation he had overheard the previous evening. Queen Camilla had been discussing arrangements with her private secretary, mentioning her concern that keeping all the corgis might not be practical given their extensive travel schedule and royal engagements. She wanted to ensure they would be placed in loving homes where they would receive the attention they deserved. The weight of tradition pressed heavily on James's shoulders as he considered what this meant. Royal protocol dictated absolute obedience to the wishes of the reigning monarchs. His military training had instilled in him an unwavering respect for the chain of command. Yet something deeper stirred within him as he thought about Muick and the promise he felt he had made to the late Queen through their shared care for the beloved animals. James remembered the last time he had seen the Queen with Muick, just weeks before her final trip to Scotland. She had been sitting in her favorite chair in the oak room, the afternoon light streaming through the tall windows as Muick dozed contentedly at her feet. The Queen had looked up at James as he entered to deliver some correspondence, and her eyes had held a particular tenderness. "James," she had said softly, "these old friends have given me such joy over the years. I do hope that when my time comes, someone will remember that they have been loved." The Queen rarely spoke about her own mortality, making her words all the more poignant and memorable. That conversation echoed in James's mind as he prepared for his duties. He understood that Queen Camilla was trying to do what she believed was best, but he also felt a profound responsibility to honor what he interpreted as the late Queen's final wish. The internal conflict was unlike anything he had experienced in his military career, where orders had always provided clear direction and purpose. The morning proceeded normally until he received word that Queen Camilla wished to see him in the blue drawing room. As he walked through the familiar corridors, James's mind raced with possibilities. Perhaps she wanted to discuss the security arrangements for an upcoming event, or maybe she needed his insight into some aspect of palace operations. He never imagined that this summons would place him at the center of a situation that would test every principle he held dear. The blue drawing room had always been one of James's favorite spaces in Windsor Castle, with its elegant silk wall coverings and magnificent collection of paintings that told the story of British royal history. Today, however, the room felt different. Queen Camilla stood near the large window overlooking the gardens, her silhouette framed against the morning light. In her arms, she held Muick, who appeared restless and uncomfortable in the unfamiliar embrace. "Sergeant Mitchell," Queen Camilla began, turning to face him with an expression that mixed determination with obvious discomfort. "Thank you for coming so promptly. I wanted to speak with you about a rather delicate matter." James stood at attention, his ceremonial uniform pristine, his posture reflecting decades of military discipline. "Of course, Your Majesty. How may I be of service?" Queen Camilla shifted Muick in her arms, and James noticed how the dog's ears were pinned back, a clear sign of stress that anyone familiar with corgis would recognize immediately. The queen consort seemed to struggle with the animal's weight and fidgeting, her discomfort becoming more apparent with each passing moment. "As you know, the question of what to do with my predecessor's beloved companions has been weighing heavily on my mind," she continued, her voice carrying the careful tone of someone who had rehearsed these words. "The king and I have given this matter considerable thought, and we believe it would be in everyone's best interest if these dear animals were placed in homes where they can receive the individual attention they require." James felt his heart rate increase, though his expression remained carefully neutral. He had suspected this conversation might come, but hearing the words spoken aloud created an unexpected emotional response. Muick, as if sensing the tension in the room, began to squirm more actively in Queen Camilla's arms. "I understand your concerns, Your Majesty," James replied carefully, "but might I respectfully ask what specific arrangements you have in mind?" Queen Camilla moved toward him, extending Muick in a gesture that was clearly intended as a transfer of responsibility. "I was hoping you might consider taking Muick yourself, Sergeant. I know how fond you were of him, and how much time you spent caring for the Queen's dogs over the years. It seems fitting that he should go to someone who already knows him well." The moment stretched between them like a chasm. James looked down at Muick, whose brown eyes seemed to hold an intelligence that transcended the simple animal-human relationship. The dog had stopped squirming and was now looking directly at him, as if understanding that this moment would determine his future. For James, this wasn't simply about accepting or declining responsibility for a pet. In his mind, Muick represented a living connection to the late Queen, a breathing reminder of the countless conversations, walks, and quiet moments they had shared. The dog embodied the trust that had developed over 23 years of faithful service, and accepting him felt like accepting a sacred charge. But something deeper troubled James about the entire situation. The casual way Queen Camilla was attempting to transfer Muick suggested she viewed the corgis as problems to be solved rather than as family members who were grieving the loss of their beloved owner. He had observed Muick's behavior over the past weeks, noting how the dog would wait by the Queen's favorite chair or search through rooms where she used to spend time. The animals were mourning too, and they deserved better than being treated as inconveniences. "Your Majesty," James said slowly, his voice carrying a weight that surprised even him, "I appreciate your confidence in my ability to care for Muick. However, I must respectfully express some concerns about this arrangement." Queen Camilla's eyebrows rose slightly, clearly not expecting resistance to what she had assumed would be a welcome solution. "What sort of concerns, Sergeant?" James took a deep breath, knowing that his next words would fundamentally alter his relationship with the new royal hierarchy. "With the greatest respect, Your Majesty, I believe Muick and the other corgis belong here, in the home they've known their entire lives. They are not just pets, but living links to Her late Majesty's legacy. Removing them from the palace feels like erasing an important part of who she was." The silence that followed was deafening. Queen Camilla's expression hardened, and James could see that his words had been interpreted as a challenge to her authority. In the complex world of royal protocol, questioning a decision of the Queen Consort was tantamount to insubordination. Sergeant Mitchell, Queen Camilla said, her voice now carrying the crisp edge of royal displeasure. I'm afraid you misunderstand the situation. This is not a matter for debate. These animals require more attention than we can provide given our responsibilities to the Crown and the Commonwealth. Surely you can appreciate the practical considerations involved. James found himself in an impossible position. His military training demanded absolute obedience to the royal family's wishes. His career, his pension, his entire future depended on maintaining the good graces of those he served. Yet standing in that elegant room, holding the gaze of a confused and grieving dog, he felt a pull towards something larger than personal consequences. I understand the practical considerations, Your Majesty, he replied, his voice steady but firm. However, I cannot in good conscience accept Muick under these circumstances. The late Queen trusted me to help care for these animals because she believed they would remain part of the royal household. Taking Muick away from his home would feel like betraying that trust. Queen Camilla's face flushed, and she took a step backward, still holding the increasingly agitated Corgi. Sergeant, I think you forget yourself. I am offering you an opportunity to provide a loving home for an animal you clearly care about. Your refusal is both surprising and, frankly, quite inappropriate. The confrontation was escalating in a way that James had never experienced during his decades of royal service. He had always prided himself on his diplomacy, his ability to navigate the complex relationships and hierarchies that defined palace life. But this situation transcended normal considerations of rank and protocol. Your Majesty, he said, his voice growing stronger with conviction, I have served this household faithfully for over 2 decades. I have never questioned an order or failed to carry out my duties with complete dedication. But this request asks me to participate in something that contradicts everything I understood about the late Queen's wishes for her beloved companions. Muick, perhaps sensing the emotional intensity of the conversation, began to whimper softly. The sound cut through the tension like a knife, reminding both humans that an innocent animal was caught in the middle of their disagreement. Queen Camilla's expression shifted from anger to something approaching bewilderment. She had clearly expected this to be a simple transaction, a convenient solution to an awkward problem. The resistance she was encountering from a mere sergeant was unprecedented and deeply unsettling. I see, she said coldly, her royal training allowing her to regain composure even as her authority was being challenged. Perhaps you need time to reconsider your position, Sergeant. I suggest you think very carefully about what your refusal might mean for your future service to this household. The threat hung in the air like a sword, and James understood exactly what Queen Camilla meant. His refusal could result in immediate dismissal, the loss of his military pension, and the destruction of a reputation built over more than 2 decades of exemplary service. For a man in his early 40s with a family to support back in Yorkshire, these consequences were nothing short of catastrophic. Yet as he looked at Muick, still trembling in Queen Camilla's arms, James felt something shift inside him. Perhaps it was the memory of the late Queen's gentle smile when she watched her corgis play in the garden. Maybe it was the recollection of countless quiet moments when she had spoken to him not as a servant, but as a fellow human being who shared her love for these remarkable animals. Whatever the source, a determination began to crystallize in his mind that surprised him with its intensity. Your Majesty, James said, his voice carrying a respect that somehow coexisted with unwavering resolve. I have considered my position carefully. While I deeply regret any inconvenience my decision may cause, I cannot accept responsibility for removing Muick from his rightful home. These corgis were not just the Queen's pets, they were her family. She would never have wanted them scattered to different homes simply because their care required effort. Queen Camilla's face registered genuine shock. In her years as a member of the royal family, she had grown accustomed to having her wishes accommodated without question. The idea that a palace employee would persist in refusing a direct request was almost incomprehensible to her. Sergeant Mitchell, she said, her voice tight with controlled anger, you are forcing me into a very difficult position. I had hoped to handle this matter quietly and amicably, but your stubbornness is making that impossible. As if summoned by the tension in the room, the door to the blue drawing room opened, and King Charles III entered, followed by his private secretary. The king's expression immediately registered the uncomfortable atmosphere, his eyes taking in the scene, his wife holding a distressed corgi, a uniformed sergeant standing rigidly at attention, and the obvious signs of a heated conversation. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important," the king said diplomatically, though his tone suggested he understood perfectly well that he was walking into the middle of a significant disagreement. Queen Camilla turned to her husband with visible relief, clearly hoping that his presence would help resolve the impasse. "Charles, Sergeant Mitchell is being rather difficult about the arrangements we discussed for Mother's corgis. I had hoped he would accept responsibility for Muick, but he seems to have some objections." King Charles looked at James with curious eyes. The king had always maintained a more distant relationship with the palace staff than his mother had, but he recognized James as a long-serving and reliable member of the household. The idea that such a person would openly defy Queen Camilla was both surprising and intriguing. "What seems to be the problem, Sergeant?" the king asked, his tone carefully neutral. James straightened his shoulders, knowing that this moment would define not only his own future, but possibly the fate of the corgis as well. Speaking directly to the king required even greater diplomatic skill than addressing Queen Camilla, but he had passed the point where caution could override conscience. "Your Majesty," James began, his voice steady and respectful, "I have been asked to take Muick away from Windsor Castle, presumably to live with me in my personal residence. While I am deeply honored by the confidence shown in my ability to care for him, I believe this arrangement would not serve Muick's best interests or honor your mother's memory appropriately." The king's expression grew more attentive. Unlike his wife, who had interpreted James's refusal as simple insubordination, Charles seemed to recognize that deeper principles might be at stake. "Please explain your reasoning, Sergeant," the king said, his voice encouraging further discussion rather than demanding immediate compliance. James felt a surge of hope. Perhaps the king would understand what Queen Camilla had missed. "Your Majesty, I had the privilege of caring for your mother's corgis for many years. I witnessed firsthand how important they were to her, not just as companions but as living symbols of the continuity and warmth that she brought to the monarchy. These animals have never known any home other than the royal residences. They are part of the fabric of palace life." Muick, still in Queen Camilla's arms, had begun to pant heavily, showing clear signs of stress. The king noticed the dog's distress and gestured for his wife to set the animal down. Once free, Muick immediately moved toward James, sitting at his feet in a gesture that spoke volumes about their relationship. "Furthermore, Your Majesty," James continued, emboldened by this display of the dog's trust, "I believe your mother would have wanted her corgis to remain here, where they could continue to bring joy to the people who work in the palace and visit these historic buildings. They represent something important about who she was as a person, and removing them feels like diminishing that legacy." Queen Camilla's face showed clear frustration with the direction the conversation was taking. "Charles, we've already discussed this. The practical considerations are overwhelming. We simply don't have the time or resources to properly care for these animals given our official duties." But the king was studying Muick, who had settled comfortably at James's feet, showing no signs of the stress he had exhibited moments earlier. A thoughtful expression crossed the monarch's face, as if he was seeing something he had previously overlooked. "You raise interesting points, Sergeant," the king said slowly. "My mother did indeed have very strong feelings about her corgis. She often spoke about how they helped humanize the monarchy, making the royal family more relatable to ordinary people." James sensed an opportunity and pressed forward carefully. "Your Majesty, if I may be so bold, keeping the corgis here would also provide wonderful opportunities for public relations. People love seeing the royal dogs, and they represent a direct connection to your mother's memory. School groups visiting the castle, foreign dignitaries, even staff members would all benefit from their presence." The suggestion clearly resonated with the king, who had always been conscious of the monarchy's public image and the need to maintain positive relationships with the British people. The corgis had indeed been one of the most beloved aspects of his mother's public persona, appearing in countless photographs and bringing smiles to millions of faces around the world. "That's actually quite a compelling argument," the king mused, much to Queen Camilla's obvious dismay. "The public relations value alone might justify the additional effort required to keep them here." Queen Camilla stepped forward, her composure beginning to crack under the pressure of seeing her carefully planned solution unraveling. "Charles, you can't be serious. We've already made arrangements, and, frankly, I don't appreciate having our decisions questioned by the staff." The king's expression grew more serious as he recognized the broader implications of what was happening. This wasn't simply about dogs anymore. It was about authority, tradition, and the delicate balance of relationships that kept the royal household functioning smoothly. "Camilla, my dear," he said gently, "perhaps we should reconsider our approach. Sergeant Mitchell clearly has deep concerns about this matter, and his long service to the crown suggests his opinions deserve serious consideration." For James, hearing the king acknowledge his perspective felt like a vindication of everything he had hoped for but barely dared expect. Yet he also understood that Queen Camilla was now in an extremely difficult position, her authority challenged and her judgment questioned in front of a subordinate. The atmosphere in the blue drawing room had become electric with tension, each person acutely aware that they were witnessing a moment that would have far-reaching consequences for everyone involved. Queen Camilla's face had flushed a deeper shade of red, and her hands trembled slightly as she struggled to maintain her composure in the face of what felt like a complete undermining of her authority. "I cannot believe what I am hearing," Queen Camilla said, her voice rising despite her efforts to maintain royal dignity. "Are we seriously going to allow palace staff to dictate policy to us? Charles, this sets an absolutely terrible precedent." The king looked uncomfortable, torn between supporting his wife and acknowledging what appeared to be a legitimate concern about his mother's legacy. His private secretary, who had been standing silently near the door, shifted nervously as he recognized the political implications of whatever decision emerged from this confrontation. James realized that his position had become even more precarious. Not only had he defied Queen Camilla's direct order, but he had also inadvertently created a rift between the king and queen that could have serious consequences for palace harmony. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him as he understood that his principled stand might have created problems far beyond his original intentions. "Your Majesties," James said carefully, "I deeply regret that my concerns have created any discord. That was never my intention. Perhaps there is a solution that could address everyone's needs while still honoring the late queen's memory." Both royals turned to look at him with expressions that mixed curiosity with skepticism. James took a deep breath, knowing that his next words might determine not only Muick's fate, but also his own future. "What if we established a formal program where the Corgis remain as official palace residents, but with specific staff members assigned to their care?" James suggested. "This would ensure they receive proper attention while maintaining their symbolic importance to the crown. We could even create educational opportunities for visitors to learn about the queen's relationship with her dogs." The king's eyes lit up with interest. As someone who had always been passionate about environmental conservation and education, the idea of creating a program that honored his mother's memory while serving a public purpose appealed to him greatly. "That's actually quite innovative," the king said, warming to the concept. "We could develop a proper care protocol, assign dedicated resources, and even create some sort of memorial garden where the Corgis could be part of the palace experience for visitors." But Queen Camilla was not ready to embrace this compromise. The entire situation had evolved far beyond her comfort zone, and she felt increasingly cornered by what she perceived as an alliance between her husband and a palace employee against her judgment. "Charles, I must insist that we discuss this privately," Queen Camilla said firmly. "This conversation has become completely inappropriate, and I don't appreciate having our family decisions debated in front of the staff." The king nodded, understanding his wife's frustration while also recognizing that the situation had reached a point where simple dismissal would no longer work. "Of course, my dear. Sergeant Mitchell, would you please wait outside while the queen and I have a brief discussion?" James bowed respectfully, but as he prepared to leave, Muick stood up and began following him toward the door. The dog's obvious preference for James's company over that of either royal created an awkward moment that highlighted the underlying issue even more dramatically. "Muick, stay," Queen Camilla commanded sharply, but the Corgi ignored her completely, continuing to follow James. The dog's disobedience in front of the king created an embarrassing situation that only reinforced Queen Camilla's argument that the animals were too difficult to manage. James paused at the door, looking back at Muick with obvious affection. "Perhaps he could come with me for a short walk while you discuss the matter? It might help calm him down." Queen Camilla's expression showed that she viewed this suggestion as yet another example of James overstepping his boundaries, but the king nodded approvingly. "Yes, that might be best. We'll send for you when we're ready to continue." As James left the room with Muick trotting happily beside him, he could hear the beginning of what promised to be a heated discussion between the royal couple. Walking through the familiar corridors of Windsor Castle, He reflected on how dramatically his life had changed in the span of a single morning. In the garden, Muick immediately relaxed, his tail wagging as he explored the familiar scents and pathways where he had walked countless times with the late queen. James watched the dog's obvious joy at being in his natural environment, and his conviction grew stronger that keeping the corgis at the palace was the right decision. Meanwhile, inside the blue drawing room, King Charles was facing one of the most difficult conversations of his marriage. Queen Camilla's anger had given way to hurt and frustration as she struggled to understand why her husband was not supporting her position more forcefully. "Charles, I feel completely undermined," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "I was trying to find a practical solution to a difficult problem, and now I'm being made to look like a villain for wanting to ensure these animals receive proper care." The king moved closer to his wife, recognizing her genuine distress. "Darling, I don't think anyone sees you as a villain. This is simply a more complex situation than we initially realized." Mother's relationship with her corgis was such a significant part of her public image that any decisions we make about them will inevitably be scrutinized. Queen Camilla sat down heavily in one of the room's elegant chairs, looking suddenly exhausted. "I never wanted to be in this position. I know how important those dogs were to her, but I also know that I'm not the right person to care for them. I don't have that same connection, and, frankly, I find the whole situation overwhelming." For the first time, the king truly understood his wife's perspective. She had been thrust into a situation where any decision would be criticized, where her actions would inevitably be compared to those of a beloved predecessor who had had decades to establish her relationship with the animals. "Perhaps that's exactly why Sergeant Mitchell's suggestion has merit," the king said gently. "If we create a formal program with dedicated staff, you wouldn't have to take personal responsibility for their daily care, but they could remain as part of the palace heritage." Queen Camilla looked up at her husband with eyes that reflected both relief and lingering uncertainty. "Do you really think that would work? And what about Mitchell? His behavior today was completely insubordinate. We can't simply ignore that." The king considered this carefully. James had indeed violated protocol by refusing a direct order from Queen Camilla, but his motivations appeared to be entirely honorable. Punishing someone for defending what he believed to be the late queen's wishes could create its own set of problems. "I think we need to consider the larger picture," the king said thoughtfully. "Mitchell has served faithfully for over 20 years. His refusal seems to come from genuine concern for Mother's memory rather than any disrespect for our authority. Perhaps we can find a way to channel that dedication constructively." As they continued their discussion, both King Charles and Queen Camilla began to recognize that this situation offered an opportunity to establish precedents for how they would handle similar challenges in the future. The monarchy was in transition, and decisions made during these early months would influence public perception for years to come. 30 minutes later, James received word that the king and Queen Camilla were ready to see him again. As he walked back toward the blue drawing room with Muick, who seemed much calmer after their garden walk, James prepared himself for whatever decision had been reached. He had made peace with the possibility of losing his position, understanding that some principles were worth the personal cost of defending them. When he entered the room, the atmosphere felt different. Both royals appeared more relaxed, though Queen Camilla's expression remained somewhat guarded. The king stepped forward with what appeared to be genuine warmth in his demeanor. "Sergeant Mitchell," the king began, "the queen and I have discussed your concerns at length, and we've decided to explore a different approach to this situation." James felt his heart rate increase, unsure whether the king's words indicated good news or simply a more diplomatic form of dismissal. "We are prepared to establish a formal royal corgi heritage program," the king continued, "with you serving as its director. This would involve creating proper care protocols, developing educational materials for palace visitors, and ensuring that Mother's beloved companions receive the attention they deserve while remaining part of the royal household." The announcement struck James like a physical blow, so unexpected and generous that he struggled to process its implications. Not only were the corgis being allowed to stay, but he was being offered a promotion rather than punishment for his defiance. "Your Majesty," James managed to say, "I am deeply honored by your confidence, but I must ask about Queen Camilla's feelings regarding this arrangement." Queen Camilla stepped forward, and James could see that she was making a genuine effort to embrace this solution despite her earlier frustrations. "Sergeant, while I was initially surprised by your passionate advocacy, I have come to appreciate that your concerns came from a place of genuine loyalty to the late queen. If this program can ensure proper care for the animals while relieving me of direct responsibility for their daily needs, then I support it completely. The relief in her voice was unmistakable, and James realized that this solution truly did address everyone's needs. Queen Camilla would no longer feel burdened by animals she felt unprepared to care for. The corgis would remain in their familiar environment, and the late queen's memory would be honored in a meaningful way. There will, of course, need to be some adjustments to protocol, the king added with a slight smile. In your new role, you'll report directly to the master of the household, and any future concerns about royal policy should be channeled through appropriate supervisory levels rather than expressed quite so directly. James understood perfectly. He was being given a face-saving way to accept what amounted to a mild reprimand, while also being rewarded for his principled stand. The king's diplomatic skills were on full display as he managed to address Queen Camilla's need to maintain authority while also acknowledging the validity of James's concerns. I understand completely, Your Majesty, and I sincerely apologize to Queen Camilla for any discomfort my earlier behavior may have caused. It was never my intention to show disrespect for your authority. Queen Camilla nodded graciously, and James could see that his apology had helped restore some of the dignity she had felt was compromised during their earlier confrontation. Now then, the king said, clearly pleased to be moving toward a positive resolution, let's discuss the practical aspects of this arrangement. You'll need to work with the palace communications team to develop materials about Mother's relationship with her dogs. The public has always been fascinated by that aspect of her life, and I think there's real potential to create something meaningful. Over the next hour, they outlined the basic framework for the program. James would oversee the daily care of all remaining royal corgis, coordinate with veterinarians and specialists as needed, and develop educational presentations for palace tours and special events. He would also work with historians to document the Queen's decades-long relationship with her beloved dogs, creating a permanent record of this unique aspect of royal life. Muick, who had been lying quietly at James's feet throughout the discussion, seemed to sense the positive resolution. His tail began wagging as the conversation continued, and he even approached Queen Camilla without showing any of his earlier stress signs. You know, Queen Camilla said, reaching down to pet Muick gently, I think this arrangement might work very well indeed. I can appreciate these lovely animals without feeling overwhelmed by their care requirements. As the meeting concluded, James felt a complex mixture of emotions. Relief at the positive outcome was mixed with amazement at how dramatically his life had changed in a single day. He had started the morning as a palace guard and was ending it as the director of an entirely new royal program. 3 months later, the Royal Corgi Heritage Program had become one of the most popular aspects of palace tours. Visitors lined up for opportunities to meet Muick and learn about the Queen's famous love for her dogs. James had developed a presentation that combined historical information with personal anecdotes, creating an emotional connection that helped people understand the human side of the monarchy. Queen Camilla had become one of the program's strongest supporters, often bringing visiting dignitaries to meet the corgis and hear James's presentations. The arrangement had evolved into exactly what the king had hoped for, a meaningful tribute to his mother's memory that also served important public relations functions. For James, the most rewarding moments came during quiet times in the palace gardens, watching Muick play in the same spots where he had walked with the late queen. The dog had thrived under the new arrangement, receiving dedicated attention while remaining in his beloved home environment. The story of the royal guard who defied Queen Camilla to protect the queen's corgis became something of a palace legend, though the details were never officially confirmed or denied. Staff members would occasionally tell visitors about the sergeant who risked his career to defend what he believed the late queen would have wanted, and how his courage had ultimately created something beautiful and lasting. James never spoke publicly about that morning in the blue drawing room, understanding that discretion remained essential even after his promotion. But he carried with him the satisfaction of knowing that he had honored a trust that transcended formal orders, and that Muick and the other corgis would continue to bring joy to people from around the world just as the queen had always intended. In the end, the confrontation that could have ended in disgrace had transformed into a story of loyalty, courage, and the power of standing up for what one believes is right, even when the personal cost seems overwhelming. The royal corgis remained where they belonged, and the queen's legacy lived on in the wagging tails and gentle eyes of the companions she had loved so deeply.